Start streaming and then I'll introduce you and we should be fine.
Okay, great.
All right, I think we're starting now. Hello, and it's my great pleasure to have Dr. Steve Turley on the episode on the channel today. I guess I think this is coming through. Okay, yes. Pardon me again. Forgive my inadequacy at OBS. Yeah. So my guest today is Dr. Steve Turley, and we're going to be discussing the West, I think religiosity in general, Christianity in particular. And there is a great reason why I have my guest on today. And it's not just because he runs a great YouTube channel that you should all subscribe to. And it's not just because he's an accomplished author, which you should go buy his books on Amazon. It's also because my guest is, in my evaluation, an accomplished optimist. And I am an accomplished pessimist. So, before I butcher my guest qualifications, perhaps, Doctor, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your work and what you do here on YouTube?
Sure, thank you for that. I'm uh, a, uh, a blessed father of four, a husband, and love my family more than anything else. I think that would be my first qualification there. And I've been in the classical school movement now for this is my 16th year. Teaching as a theology and rhetoric teacher. I've been in academia, college academia, for about 22 years. I have degrees in music and theology. I like to say I went where the money is, and I found that the way music and theology sort of came together was in theological aesthetics. And I found that classical education tended to be a place where theological aesthetics and their emphasis on truth, goodness, and beauty could really flourish.
Hmm.
My doctoral studies involved the interface between cultural anthropology and Christianity, early Christianity in its formative period. So for the last decade or so, I've been fascinated with the intersection between culture and religion, and
Hmm.
so that really birthed a YouTube channel, on November 1st of 2016 at the behest of one of my colleagues, who said I really needed to get out there and start talking about the kind of stuff with a wider audience, just getting out of academia, which I did. And so since November 1st of 2016, basically on a daily basis, we've been analyzing political, economic, cultural trends. But in light of what I'm seeing as larger conservative dynamics, and that tends to be sort of the shtick of the channel on YouTube.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm. Well, I welcome seeing your videos in my feed as sort of a bromide against my counsel of despair. But perhaps we'll get into that later. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about the classical education movement. That's something I've been very interested in, and obviously you're much more involved in it than I am. So perhaps you could take a minute or two to just explain to the audience what that's about.
Oh, sure. So classical education is, we would define it basically as a pedagogy that seeks to enculturate students in the true, the good, and the beautiful through the acquisition of wisdom and virtue. It is an educational tradition. It's about 2,500 years old. All our founding fathers were classically educated. All the great theologians, the wonderful G.K. Chesterton, they were all availed themselves of this kind of education that centers on the great books, the great ideas, the seven liberal arts as really the basis by which we encounter what it means to be truly human.
Mm-hmm.
And it went through a renaissance of late, just the last 30 years or so. In 1994, there were 10 classical schools in the nation. Today, by estimates, there are over 500. They're operated by churches or by Christian organizations. Homeschooling co-ops. There's some estimates that the majority of homeschoolers now, which is topping several million, actually have a kind of classical education curriculum. And even charter school movements are now getting into it. I believe there's somewhere upwards of about 120 classical charter schools as well. So it's a movement that just keeps growing, and we're already seeing the fruits of it. Classically educated students are getting the highest scores, bar none, in their SATs, the ACTs. Patrick Henry College boasts of as being basically the terminator of national and international moot court competitions. And so we're seeing the recovery of rhetoric. We're seeing the recovery of all things beautiful, true, and good.
Yeah, I think this is sort of a missed opportunity. A lot of private schools have even walked away from the focus on great works and classical modes of being taught really the tools for thinking. And that's something that seems to be a big deficit in our own modern institutions of education, at least at a lower level. And
Oh
I'm
my.
sure we'll get into the upper level too. But I think, in your experience, the classical education movement, it's linked closely to religious tradition, or
Yeah, very much so. So it'll either be explicitly so in some kind of, um, denominational allegiance, a Reformed confession, or Catholic schools. We're seeing a mass movement among Catholic education towards the liberal arts tradition, which of course was its tradition for centuries. But then in our charter school movements, we're seeing more a reliance sort of on what we might call the great tradition. So it's not going to be explicitly religious, but it's certainly conveying much of the tradition that is itself highly formative in religious ways.
and is this great tradition that's the Western canon as it was formerly known, or Bloom would
You
have called
got
it?
it. Yeah. So basically the Western canon. So literature, art, music, poetry, drama that have been considered mediators of the transcendent truth, goodness, and beauty to the human soul, and then therefore enables the human soul to cultivate both wisdom in terms of a knowledge of the divine economy of goods in all things, and a virtue to learn to love that divine economy and order their loves in accordance with it.
That is the great loss of our age, is, in my opinion, the loss of the virtue ethics tradition. But your own religious background, is it a Protestant or Catholic or Orthodox?
Yeah, I'm Orthodox. I've been Orthodox for about 12 years now, but I grew up in New England, which is
Mm.
very secular. But I always had a love for all things Christianity in terms of its aesthetics. My favorite
Mm.
artist was Michelangelo. I loved the Sistine Chapel. I
Mm.
loved whenever I'd go to the library, I'd read. I'd always go to the Bible section and read the Bible stories and look at the illustrations there. My moral imagination was captivated by Scripture, but there was really no grounding there. And in my early 20s, I really, for lack of a better term, had a real conversion and turned towards Christianity, primarily through the Presbyterian tradition, conservative
Mm-hmm.
Presbyterian tradition. Went to Reformed seminary originally, and then about 12 years ago or so, I had always loved the liturgical sacramental vision of the church that I just felt that the Reformed tradition lacked, and then made the big plunge that a lot of people have been making of late into Eastern Orthodoxy.
I hear that's a growing religion in America. It feels like it. I know a lot of Orthodox converts.
Yes, yeah, right. Yeah, it's I think, we'll probably get into it, but as I've kind of reflected on it over the years, it seems to me it is something akin to what scholars are calling retraditionalization. So Pope
Mm.
Benedict brings back the Latin Mass, and everybody thinks that all the attendees are going to be over the age of 70, reminiscing on what it was like to worship before Vatican II. And they were astonished to find out that the attendees were actually between the ages of 16 and 26. There was a real hunger, real thirst for deep pre-modern traditions to inform one's life today.
And that retraditionalization is a very frequent theme on your channel, and it's one I'm hoping that you'll explore a little bit. Now, before you lay out your case, my channel is not all despair. I'm also a traditionalist, as everyone who's watching this knows. But I do frequently throw out a little bit. Every now and again, I get a tidbit of what you talk about in your channel is retraditionalization, and usually the two things you usually throw out there is orders of priests that have a lot of young adherents. In my tradition, the Catholic tradition, they're almost all of the conservative orders, and they almost all are in an orthodox direction. And on sort of the macrocosmic level, that's a microcosmic trend. Then the macrocosmic level, we just see clearly from worldwide statistics that while secularism might be growing in key areas of the West, as the overall population projections move into the 150 to 200 year periods, you just see secularism and atheism as a force falling away like a shadow because of the very, very low birth rates that come from the populations that it's growing in. So what you have for secular atheism is sort of them taking up an increasing share of a declining market, which is never a formula for success. But anyway,
that's a great way of putting it. Yeah, no, it's very, very well put. Yeah.
Maybe you could go a little bit deeper into what you see as retraditionalization. That's a mouthful.
It is. It is. I mean, these $5 words, I'll tell you. Yeah. Sure. I think the best way to think of retraditionalization is to understand it as over and again exactly what you were saying, sort of the secularizing, globalizing, modernist tendencies that Chesterton and C.S. Lewis and Solzhenitsyn were such absolutely profound and wonderful critics of, students of. And basically what modernity does, the key secularizing force is something that scholars call detraditionalization. And detraditionalization is this, it's basically this process whereby modern societies kind of, they disembed time and space away from localized control and kind of reconfigure it around this local, transnational, even transcontinental sort of economy that redefines the human person more as a consumer and as a sovereign individual that has these, human rights to decide how to exercise sovereign control over their own lives. And localized customs and traditions and ways of life tend to really suffer in that framework. And so rather than just kind of lie down and accept it, what we're finding is populations are actually initiating a blowback against that. So the more populations, and this is really, like you said, just all over the world, the studies come from, Kyrgyzstan and Russia and in Sri Lanka and India, you name it. They're finding that populations, when they feel like their customs, their traditions, their religions are being threatened, they tend to reassert very intentionally those customs, traditions, and religions in such a manner that they act as mechanisms of resistance against these secularizing tendencies and globalization. So basically what retraditionalization is, it could be really summed up with this. What our grandparents took for granted, we have to be very intentional about. What our grandparents took for granted, we have to be really intentional about. So, for example, you mentioned the whole fertility issue. Well, back in the day, our great-grandparents had lots of kids because they needed, workers on the farm or something, to help out or something. Today, we have lots of children because we're intentionally trying to perpetuate a Christian worldview and a Christian value system. That's that's retraditionalization. It's irrespective of the circumstances of those traditions in the past. Now it's a real intentional sort of fighting on behalf of those traditions, and we're finding it's extremely explosive in terms of its power and its capacity to captivate the imagination all over the world.
Well, I'll that maybe I should start probing this a little bit, because I think most people would believe that these political movements are in some sense short-lived, and that we're well, I mean, quite frankly, we're seeing a reaction against sort of globalization and corporate forces on some scale. But to
Right.
this date, the ability of any of those movements to project power into institutions of high influence has been, well, somewhat limited. Some might say very limited.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you have a few politicians here and there getting elected who come from what one might say is more nationalist parties. But
Mm-hmm.
then there's a difficulty with the fact that you just don't have this view at all represented in modern cultural institutions of the media or educational
Right.
variety, except for institutions developed to be explicitly countercultural in many ways.
Right. Yeah, yeah, parallel structures, as it were.
Mm.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the best way to understand the world right now is a dialectic. That's a term I
Mm.
use a lot on the channel as well. So the dialectic is really between sort of this modernist globalization on the one side and this sort of religious nationalism, populist retraditionalization on the other. So, in one sense, secularism is more powerful than it's ever been, precisely because it's more pervasive than
Mm.
it's ever been, and because it's more intense. It's pushing out its logical outworkings, or we would smile and probably say illogical outworkings.
Mm.
Um, but in another sense, and I think you caught it, it's weaker than it's ever been. And it's weaker than it's ever been because its roots, its modernist roots, have rotted out. And this is particularly
Mm.
the work of Stepan Mistrovich over at Texas A&E, who's made the very interesting observation that post modernity, starting, like say in Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition in the late 1970s,
Mm.
postmodernity basically came out and called the bluff of secularism and secular modernity and said, hey, that skepticism and that doubt that you apply to everything that is somehow then dispelled by the scientific method,
Mm.
we're going to apply that same skepticism and doubt to your scientific method. we're going to apply that same skepticism and doubt to your scientific rationalist meta narrative. And
This
so,
is yeah. You go
yeah,
ahead.
so in many respects, postmodernism, that certainly has all its problems, but postmodernism called the bluff of modernity. The bluff is that it tried to be skeptical of all other worldviews except its own. And once it started turning such skepticism to its own frames of reference, it ends up imploding like a paper tiger in many respects. So what we have then is we have the roots of modernity having rotted out, even although the fruits of modernity in terms of secular globalization, they continue to be exported by our elite institutions that are profiting off of
Mm.
them. Media, politicians, economics, the economic institutions alike. What's happening is because of the rotting out of the roots, there's the massive blowback. Its roots are strong. Its roots are very powerful. It's drawing from pre-modern roots. And from that vantage point, then, we could see it having maybe a permanent presence is too strong of a word, but certainly a formidable presence for the foreseeable future. And we are beginning to see the reconstitution of societies around religious nationalism, particularly India, Russia, Poland, Hungary, and the like. So
Mm.
it is starting to actually happen, even at the political, economic, and media levels.
That's it. I mean, you said this is something that I think a lot of people like. Well, I know that probably Jordan Peterson is aware of this, but a lot of people who bash postmodernism as being the culmination of the left wing, and in some ways it is. it does contain within it a seed that might bring us back to a more fundamental, a more primal way of looking at the world that was found earlier in human existence. It does
Yeah.
seem to be a way out of modernity, or hinted a way out of modernity. And for that reason, I have learned not to discard postmodernism altogether, because
Right.
I think that it's you never should pretend like previous periods of thought didn't exist. So the solution to modernity is not to become neo-romantics. The solution to modernity is to become postmodernists.
Right.
And
Right.
yeah, so I think that's interesting. The concern I think that a lot of people like myself have is, I do agree with you that the roots that we have for our own modern society are kind of falling apart. The book I have cracked open right now is Patrick Denon's Why Liberalism Failed, which is a fascinating book, and I really recommend anyone who wants to understand this, they should read it. He's a professor from Notre Dame, or I guess it's Notre Dame, and he writes about how our concept of liberalism, how we set up secular states, is slowly eroding away in the modern era due to its own contradictions. The
Hmm.
difficulty is that I have a hard time imagining some kind of mass political movement of anti-modernity coming up in the modern environment and displacing them, and then accomplishing some kind of transition of power that would be anything like we've ever seen. This isn't. It seems really unlikely that we're going to get like traditionalist Reagan, and there's not going to be a handover. I mean, there might be a temporary handover of political power, but I don't think. I mean, the universities aren't going to start. I mean, I see no mechanism from which the universities or the media or any of these other things are going to start tenuring and supporting and basically accomplishing a changing of the guard that will put anti-modern or anti-liberal perspectives, especially anti-liberal conservative or traditionalist perspectives, into seats of authority in the modern Western world. Everything seems like it's armed against that possibility.
Yes, no, it's great. Again, I think you're definitely pressing in on the intensity and the strength of secularity and modernity in the within the dialectic. So no question. Again, things universities are more secular. They're more tribalistic. They're more
Mm-hmm.
postmodern than they've ever been. No question about it.
But
In that
more
sense.
pertinent than that, corporations are more
Oh yeah.
progressive than they ever been, and that's something that's really interesting, because corporations being progressive is something you see very prominently in our age. It's not something you see a lot in previous ages. They tend to be, well, more or less in favor of the status quo, but now they're coming out with explicitly progressivist and explicitly, well, I would say what some people might call social justice warrior policies, and
Oh
I think
yeah.
this blindsided a lot of people. And
Oh
so
yeah.
what you
Yeah.
end up having is you have, from what I see, if Trump is an indication of rebellions against the modern globalist order, and what you really have is you have a populist movement that is decapitated from any mechanism it might have for appealing to some kind of authority, be it academic, corporate, or government. And by government, I mean not the elected politicians, but where a lot of the government power rests is just the broad range of bureaucrats that make it up. Appointed individuals, people who don't have to actually go up for election again and again, overwhelmingly come down on the progressive globalist side.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, it really comes down to what do we call lifestyle values, and it's part
Mm-hmm.
of the disembedding processes. It is in a corporation's interest to see the world become more and more consumerist, narcissistic, secularist, and the like. I mean, what? How else do you explain the NFL
Mm-hmm.
taking a stand for on behalf of transgender bathrooms? You know what the heck interest does the NBA and the NFL have for transgender bathrooms. Of course, I'm referring to the whole North Carolina bill that said you have to go use the bathroom, the gender that's on your birth certificate. Why on earth would they care? Well, they care because they're part of a corporatist transcultural system that has no loyalty to culture, religion, land, language, the like, and finds such traditions actually as impediments to consumer-based lifestyle values.
Mm-hmm.
So they absolutely foster a thoroughly liberal conception of the world, and then find the emancipatory politics that tends to be connected with that. Emancipatory politics simply being the formal way that we're going to push traditions, customs, religions into the private sphere of life so as to liberate people, to emancipate them from those supposedly arbitrary impediments on their lives. They side with that in its politically correct, political liberal outworking. Absolutely no question. Here's the problem, though, that you have in terms of the idea that this is the brave new world that is in perpetuity here. What we're
Mm-hmm.
finding throughout the world now is a mass blowback precisely against these consumer-based tendencies. You're seeing it in Russia. You're seeing it in Poland, in Hungary. You're seeing it in India in particular. This is where now the religious nationalism has actually gotten the reins of power. And what you're seeing, and they're being supported by this by enormous majorities, what you're seeing is a blowback against this precisely because people are starting to interpret, at least particularly in the West, as the same economic processes that are draining their communities of their industrial and manufacturing jobs. So they see this, this corporatism, this trans-corporate economy as basically destroying their life. I think it was Obama's last year in office, we saw a loss of 60,000 manufacturing jobs. Well, of course, Trump's reversed that in this year with over, 200 and some odd thousand manufacturing jobs, 3% unemployment in manufacturing today. That's something they love. That's something that the populace, the heartland, is for. And they don't like when the NFL wants to celebrate its liberal values and emancipatory politics by sort of this cultural Marxist, rituals of kneeling.
Mm-hmm.
You saw how the vast majority of football fans responded. They turned off their TV. My son was getting his hunting license actually just a couple of months back, and we were in the class together, and the fellow, I mean, we had a room of about 50 people, and the fellow was giving, who's doing the training session, was giving a wonderful little anecdote, and he wanted to compare sort of hunting with football, and he stopped and he said, not that any of us are watching it this year, and the place erupted in laughter. Now, I know these tend to be NRA guys, but this is precisely what we're talking about. There is a real blowback. You don't see it on television. Certainly, it's going to be hidden from you via the media because they don't consider it news. You don't see it on Amazon, but it's really that academics are recognizing it. They're seeing it. So what we're
Yeah,
seeing.
but I guess to push back, I mean, the fact that this eruption came in the NFL, like, which is a skew conservative organization, right? Like, you don't have. I mean, I come from a progressive community. I converted to Christianity in my adulthood, and you don't. I still live in a progressive community, even though I'm very conservative or traditionalist myself. You just don't see progressives don't have to go out to watch like Rent or to watch or to watch progressive material, movies, plays, and have the actors and corporations that put on their play go like, "We hate your politics. Please change them."
No, no,
Like
no. Yeah,
it never they have never had to do that. So I
right.
mean, the battlefield essentially is on the home turf of the conservative, and the fact that I mean, what's happened to the NFL is they've temporarily tried to stage a coup that would have. I mean, in my mind, if the NFL went down, I couldn't really largely think of a piece of conservative media that I would say is kind of skews conservative that most of the country watches. So that's a
Yeah, no,
difficulty I
no,
have is
yeah, no,
these mechanisms are
I
kind
would
of
disagree with
limited.
that. I would disagree with that entirely.
Mm-hmm.
No, you have on YouTube now personalities that have double conservative personalities that have double the subscribers as CNN and
Mm-hmm.
MSNBC. No, I don't buy that right now. Yes, it's parallel structures right
Mm-hmm.
now. But I think we're at the this is the tip of the sword. This is we. I
Hmm.
often say you ain't seen nothing yet, and I don't do that lightly. I choose my words very very carefully there. No, no,
No,
no.
sure, sure. That's a possibility. Yeah, go. Keep on going. Keep on going, please.
Yeah, so no, what we are seeing is we're seeing the initial phase of a blowback, initial phase. The blowback isn't going to go away because globalization isn't going to go away. Globalization basically hollows out nations, it hollows out borders, it hollows out culture, it hollows out economy with these disembedding.
But the thing
Uh,
is, it gives the people who do it a huge windfall of cash because of
it
economies of
certainly does.
scale.
It certainly does, no question. But that's not helping them so much right now in Russia. That's not helping them so much in India. That's not helping them in Poland. That's not helping them in Hungary. One could even argue it's not even particularly helping them in Japan with its renewed Shintoism. So they can have all the cash they want. Guess what? They end up becoming Russian Orthodox in Russia. They can
Mm-hmm.
have all the cash they want. All of a sudden, they're going and proclaiming Jesus Christ as Lord and King over their nation in Poland. What we have seen in certain nations where and they tend to be what's really interesting is they tend to have been in some way colonized explicitly, either via communism on the one hand or say British colonies on the other. They tend to have been colonized and now they're tasting their traditions again, their way of life that was taken away from them for a certain period of time. India is a very interesting one too. Bill
Mm-hmm.
Cavanaugh, I'm sure you're familiar with, has done a wonderful study on how Hinduism was reinvented by British colonialists in the late 19th century. And in 1947, when they got their
Mm-hmm.
independence, virtually all of their leaders, all their bankers, all their professors, all their educated elite, all of them were educated in Britain. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
very similar to what we have. It's as I think it was Peter Berger who basically said America is like a bunch of Indians ruled by Swedes,
Mm-hmm.
right? So where India is the most religious nation in the world, Sweden's the most secular nation in the world. India had that. Turkey had that. The Ataturk reformulation of Anatolia was a thoroughly secular aristocracy
Mm-hmm.
overseeing a very religious populace. See, very something. The Shah tried to do the same thing in Iran, um, but it never made it into the heart of the people. And so, what you're seeing now is a blowback, and politicians have figured out that if the trajectories are moving in this conservative direction, this is where the money is. This is where the power is. This is where the dynamism is for the future. And all you have to do is look at the fertility rates, like you mentioned. Secularists are basically killing themselves. They're destroying, they're gay marriaging themselves out of existence. They're aborting themselves out of existence. They're having less than 2.1 children consistently, whereas Christians are having an enormous amount of children in relation to that
Well, yeah,
2.5.
relative to the secularists, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And
but it's
this, and
still
you can
much.
see herein lies what obviously would be what the I would say the cosmopolitans believe is their solution to this, which is that the Turk who votes for Ataturk in Turkey will vote for Merkel in Germany.
Yeah, sure,
So
sure. Yeah,
if you import conservative people of a different culture into your country, you will
sure, sure, sure.
manufacture implicitly progressive voters.
Of course, open borders means open values. You know, I mean, anthropologists have pointed that out. Open borders means open values, precisely why we're closing borders. And borders are being closed everywhere, everywhere. Border walls. There was an article that came out. So 2016 was the year of the wall, and they
So,
pointed. Yeah. So the
so you,
point
you,
is,
you think that, that what we're seeing right now is going to become just the de facto political order and sort of the consensus position for, because I mean here's the thing, right? It would have to do better than it's doing right now, right? Because
yeah, yeah, yeah.
right now, if I make this point, closed borders is a partisan issue, And the one thing we know about politics is it's cyclical. So
Oh,
if you
sure, sure.
cycle between closed borders and open borders, that's functionally an open border because half closed and half open is open.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
No, no,
so in
no.
order
Yeah, no
for
question.
closed borders to actually be a long-term demographic thing, it would have to become a third rail of American politics. Is that
Yeah,
what
yeah,
you're
but
foreseeing?
I would say it is. I would say to say it's a partisan issue, I think completely ignores how hated Trump was within Republican ranks.
Well,
I
I mean,
mean,
it currently is a partisan issue. Maybe it won't be in four to
no,
ten
no, they,
years.
they've done polls that have shown that even a slight majority of Democrats favor massive tightening around the borders.
Hmm.
No, I don't agree with that. I think you're seeing today is I think you're seeing three insecurities emerge. That's what scholar Maybelle Berezin has argued from Cornell University. You're seeing border insecurity, you're seeing economic insecurity, and you're seeing cultural ontological insecurity. And those insecurities, they transcend party. So economic insecurities were expressed and potentially resolved by two candidates, two populist candidates in the last election. Bernie Sanders on the left, Trump on the right. They
Mm-hmm.
were talking populist language. Populism, by its nature, extends beyond left, right, conservative, liberal, and the like. Border security is definitely a bit more on the right, definitely. And then ontological security almost completely on the right. This is why the right is winning, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
This is why the left is losing. The left is losing everywhere we look. And I don't see it as cyclical in the same way. Cyclical is, well, the issues cycle, and then we see who's able to better the other with the cycled issues. These issues have extraordinary staying power precisely because of the disembedding processes of globalization. So I do see this as a beginning, and I see border security, economic security, and ontological security as being the dominant political issues of the foreseeable future. And they are actually remaking the political map throughout the world.
So, but if you, but by this prediction, you would think that I mean, we could expect, I suppose that might be a better way of saying it. We could expect that the immigration restrictionist side of the Democratic Party will reassert itself in perhaps the medium to short term.
Democratic Party will reassert itself as a far left party. It has to. That's what's going on in Europe. Center
Well,
left is dead.
that seems to complement the idea that the cycle will persist, and
No, 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 no. It's fitting in perfectly. It's
so will the
that would
Democratic
be
Party be locked out then?
that would be the economic security. So they would be pushing because Democrats have nothing to offer in terms of border security, and they have nothing to offer in terms of ontological security. Nothing, except of course if you're a secularist feeling like you're dying. And now we're having a retraditionalization on the secular side of things, right? They're trying to stay alive, but they're not
So
because
you think the
again,
Democrats they'll be far left, but they
I
will avoid the border issue,
yeah.
or
Oh, of course, because that's their voters. Number one. Number two, it's considered illiberal to lock people out and exclude. No,
well,
absolutely.
but I mean, what I mean, let's say there's a Democrat in the White House, he would have to understand immediately that his political interest was a closed border and assert that
Absolutely,
explicitly. Because
absolutely. Well,
he could just do what
if
Obama does, just don't enforce the law, right? And then all of a
yeah,
sudden you're
no,
back to
I
square
mean,
one.
if they could commit suicide, they could say, well, we know politically this is in our interest, but if we were to do this, we would lose our constituency. They're caught between a rock and a hard place. Just look at what's happened in Western Europe in 2017. The Tony Blair Institute produced a study that found that in 2017, 900 and some odd districts had elections. Of those 900 plus districts, 6% had the center left either hold their position that they were electorally or gain. Now that's, I mean, even Tony Blair Institute recognizes. New York Times came out and said there are parts of Western Europe where the center left has withered away and died. It's not
But
there.
the far left has made up the gains, though,
Oh
and
yeah,
they're open borders.
yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. So this is where the politics it's going. It's going through towards those three insecurities.
But
The three
what I'm
ins
saying is, in order to actually accomplish this, you need to lock out the open borders from political power.
Oh, eventually that would happen, sure,
Mm.
because the border security issue isn't going away. Eventually, they have borders in Greece. They have borders in France. They have
Mm.
border walls. I'm sorry, not borders. Border walls in Greece. Border walls in France. Okay, but I mean Macron is pro border wall. Okay, this is
that's not the pertinent number in this case. Is not the border wall. The pertinent number is the net amount of migration into the country.
well, yes and no. I mean the net amount of
No,
migration,
I'm pretty sure
ironically.
that is
No,
because
no, no, no,
if the net
no. Yeah,
migration in the country exceeds the amount of popularity you lose from a pro-immigration policy, then you can make
no,
yourself
yeah,
whole
yeah. Well. Good
politically.
luck with that. That would be a
It
mass
it
amount
seems
of
like Merkel
immigration.
has had good luck with this.
Well, she has, but not the rest. You see, so now you're seeing. Look at what happened in Austria next
Hmm.
door. Austria had a 60% center right coalition voted in, and part of which was the far right. So you're seeing that. What I'm saying is you're seeing this mass blowback, and if it gets really bad, then you begin to see secession. Secession is
Hmm.
then the next step. And secession, we've had 35 nations added to the world map since 1991. And it's only getting more.
Hmm.
Where you are, did I not just see that they're trying to create something like the new California, right?
Yeah.
To seize it, but this is natural. You see, this is part of a dynamic where people no longer believe in a mass meta narrative where it's a one size fits all for everyone. They no longer buy into the mass technical structures that govern their lives. They're looking towards localism, they're looking towards tradition, customs, and so forth as the basis for their social order. And to the extent that the liberal Democrats want to impose this one size fits all secular society on the rest of the, well, then you get Texit,
Hmm.
then you get secession. That's where the world is going. The
Well,
world is
that would be a bit more difficult proposition considering Texas did try to secede, and I mean, I don't think that's actually a legal mechanism to accomplish that.
well, you can go back and forth with that. I'm sure what I'm explaining to you are the dynamics.
Hmm.
The dynamics are very simple. They're very, very simple.
Hmm.
You have two forces going on right now. You have the force of globalization that wants more and more centralization of power politically, economically, demographically, and the like. And then as a blowback to that, you have people who want more localism, they want more of their cultures, their traditions, and so forth. That's not going away. That's very powerful. They have an ace in the hole. Their traditions are sound.
I'm just trying to
The
figure out how this is going to manifest itself. Like,
well,
would we expect to see, so one way I guess it can manifest itself is that left wing political parties could become anti immigration. Another way it could manifest itself is that left wing parties are locked out politically. A
yeah,
third
there.
way I suppose it could manifest itself is some kind of creeping march through the institutions by conservative forces, which
Well,
I personally
and
haven't seen yet, but
yeah,
maybe.
and all three. Well, careful. I now studies are coming out saying the right is taking over the courts. But again, yet you're talking in the last couple of years, and also be careful too because look, we're more pro-life today than we've ever been since Roe v. Wade. We've cut the abortion rates in half in the last 30 years. We have now 90% of our counties without a single abortion clinic. There were 2,000 abortion clinics in 1991. Today, there are barely 500. It's a 75% reduction. This isn't a one-way road where
Mm-hmm.
secularism is just killing everything and we're all just sitting there going, ah, crap, oh, well, there's nothing we can do. I know people do that, but let them do that. I think what we're seeing actually modernist roots dying and globalization doing everything it can to export its fruit as quick as it can. But if you know anything about horticulture, of course, when a root of a plant dies, it's only a matter of time before its fruit dies as well. And what you're seeing in Europe in many respects is the death of the center left and the ascendance of center right dominating their politics.
I mean, the thing is here is that you're kind of you're even from my pessimistic point of view, I understand what you're saying is right. The root of pardon me, the root of modernity is diseased and it will die. The difficulty is we are part of a common body with this diseased portion. And it's unclear to me whether this diseased portion is just such a large part of our body that when it dies, it will just take the entire apparatus down with it. And the entire apparatus of the West will just be devoured by other traditionalist civilizations that more or less have an interest in its own destruction.
Yeah, I don't particularly see that. What I'm seeing is I'm seeing a very healthy blowback. And that blowback, granted, it tends to rely more on parallel institutions, but in many respects, those parallel institutions we're finding are incredibly resilient. Just again, taking the Christian family is far more resilient than a secular family. Take education, Christian education now, classical education, far more resilient than secular education. Just the whole notion of healthcare. You look at the rise of healthcare sharing ministries that are revolutionizing the way healthcare is administered and paid for. Most hospitals to this day, most hospitals in this country are owned or affiliated with a denomination, and they operate by distinctively Christian ethical principles. You notice the pro-life issue going the way it is. Our prisons, for example, as well. Prisons, because of budget cuts, the majority of our prisons have their counseling and their education services provided for entirely by local conservative churches and seminaries. So Christian activism, political, social, cultural activism is very powerful. It's very alive, very well.
So at some point, this wellspring.
Let me finish my point. And it is creating, in many ways, a parallel structure to this. So if they look, secularists are not, according to Eric Kaufman, secularists by around 2050, starting around that time, are not going to be much more than about 14% of our population. 85% of the population will be thoroughly religious. Rodney Stark predicts that within 4 generations, the same is going to happen for Western Europe. The world is moving more and more in a religious conservative trajectory. Secularists can burn Rome all they want. We'll clean it up. But this whole notion that they're just going to take us down and have us just rot into the ground while other nations just come and hoard us. I'm not seeing any evidence for that. Ironically, I think what that's doing is it's giving credence to a sociological theory known as secularization, which says that the world is just guaranteed to get more and more and more secular as it gets more and more technological.
No, I don't.
Hold on. From Peter Berger onward, no sociologist really worth their salt takes that seriously. And what we're seeing from a lot of cultural critics today on the right is we're just seeing the inversion of that. We're seeing a mirror image of that, saying, well, yes, secularization is going to get worse and worse and worse, and that's just going to take our society down. It's the same thing, but it's just coming from a different angle.
Okay, I wasn't saying that we're going to secularize. I was saying that when you look just at the West, because secularization worldwide is dying, but the thing is that secularization mostly exists in the West.
Sure.
So if Turkey essentially, if Turks in 50 years make up the majority of the population of Germany, and Christians the minority, Germany will be less secular. Germany will be less secular, but it will not be more Western. It will be an extension of Turkey's lack of secularism into the West. And if the process continues like that, then secularism is certainly going to die just because it's not stable.
Yeah.
The poison will have spread so far throughout the apparatus of that society, it's enough to take it
Right.
down. Now,
Right.
to me, in order for there to be a turnaround in the West, at some point, the welling up will have to either the alternative institutions that are being developed will have to displace their mainstream ones, or it seems to me that there'll have to be some kind of march through the institutions, so to speak.
Sure. And I think it's a both and. I don't think it's necessarily an either or. I think it's definitely a both and. So you're seeing, for example, in the philosophy departments today in secular institutions, largely the behest of the work of J.P. Moreland and others. They're becoming staffed by Christian professors who, I mean, in many respects, we are seeing sort of a small little renaissance via the honors colleges of the liberal arts tradition making its way back into prominence in our college campuses, and bringing the more insane they get with the identity politics and the emancipatory politics, the more stable and the more sane and the more sober the liberal arts tradition appears. So I see it as both and. You can have Liberty University and Patrick Henry and the like on the one hand, and you can start infiltrating Yale on the other. But I see that as happening via the demographic shifts. So right now, for example, conservative Christians make up about, say, 65%, maybe 60% of regular church attendees. Now, 30 years ago, they were a little more than 30%. It's largely because the mainline churches have been imploding. But the actual amount of people who attend church regularly has not changed in 50 years. So we're seeing conservative Christians actually becoming more of a figure, a percentage of the wider society as a whole. And as these trends continue, what Kaufman and Stark and others are arguing is you're going to find a tipping point. At some point, you're going to find that conservative, traditionalist, Orthodox Christians are actually hitting that 49, 51, 53%. And then their conception of society ends up becoming more and more the norm. Now, when it starts hitting even higher rates, 60, 65, 70%, then we're talking within decades here. We're not talking 100 years from now.
It will need to be in decades.
What's that?
It won't have to be in decades, otherwise the project will simply fail.
Oh, sure.
It'll
sure.
have to be very immediate at this stage.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So the breaking point Kaufman sees is 2030. So we're talking 12 years from now. He's seeing conservative Christians as reaching the 50% mark.
So
yeah.
For my money, the thing is that there's going to be, I'll feel like a big turning point will be reached when progressive people who are urban progressives, which are my own tribe, urban progressives, the point where they actually have to admit they have to actually contend with conservative Christian culture.
Yeah.
That will be a moment when a turning point will be not like 50%. I mean, like, we have to acknowledge it exists as something legitimate. And the difficulty is that walking through the institutions that I interact with, at this stage, there's no evidence of that.
No. Right. There's no evidence at this point of a 50% plus infiltration of.
Yale doesn't even feel like it has to acknowledge this demographic as something that exists. Period.
Right. Exactly.
Like the 1%. Like, Yale is more concerned and will identify more with will call out a 1% Muslim population in the United States. It does not feel like it has to contend at all with any kind of conservative Christian culture whatsoever.
Right. No, absolutely. No, definitely. We're not. Again, I see us really at the beginning. Again, it's not even me. It's Eric Kaufman, who I think that's a quote straight from his book. We are at the beginning of a demographic revolution. So these are beginnings here. And what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to identify these trends, trace them out, and say, wait a minute now. But it's funny, you say I'm an optimist. Actually, I'm a pessimist. I had to get convinced of this stuff. I read the studies. I came across this thing called post-secular scholarship. And my first reaction was, what? How could there be something called post-secular? I was studying in the university, what are you talking about? And I sat down and I started reading some of these scholars, and I, gave them a consideration. And the more and the more and the more I read, I found that sort of the Charles Taylor analysis of, secularization is here to stay. It's the permanent structure. And you know what? It's probably the best of all the possible alternatives that we have. That most sociologists weren't seeing that. They may believe secularism is the best alternative that we have, but they are lamenting the fact that its days are coming to an end.
Okay, well, I think I have to get to dinner, so perhaps we can wrap this up. I think my pessimism has been tempered. I think that hearing a lot of good ideas, and I hope we can follow this up. I'm certainly encouraged by what you say, and I hope my audience will take the initiative to read your books and watch your channel. And I know the link isn't there currently, but I'll have it uploaded when the video goes onto the video feed. So, do you want to just, I don't know, make a final statement about what you see coming down the line in the future? I certainly think that if indeed we're going to see a retraditionalization of culture generally, well, that's great for me because having a traditionalist media source, it seems like I'm buying into stock that's going to rise. But
That's right.
do you want to just lead out with what your vision for the future is? Anything you want to impart to our guests before we finish up the live stream?
Sure. I just the trajectories that we've been examining here really do revolve around a couple of set parameters here, and I think the first parameter is there. We are in the midst of a dialectic. We are seeing on the one side secular globalization, on the other side sort of this traditionalist nationalism blowing back against this secularism. What gives the nationalist traditionalism its leverage is that the modernist roots have rotted out. Globalism is still being exported at record paces, no question about it, by the West. But there is this mass worldwide blowback, including within the West, against it that seems to be just as formidable, particularly at the ballot box, and it doesn't seem to be going away. And what I'm finding, what I'm most hopeful for is how this retraditionalization really is reigniting some of the most noble and some of the most beautiful aspects of our culture and our tradition, most especially classical education, the reigniting of the sense the world's filled with divine meaning and purpose, that wisdom is a knowledge of that divine meaning and purpose, and that virtue is ordering our loves in accordance with that divine meaning and purpose so that we can experience our highest human flourishing. Keep an eye on that. Classical education, I think, is going to be a real treasure as it expands and as it itself flourishes in the days ahead.
All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the stream, everyone. I want to thank Dr. Turley again for appearing. Maybe I can have you on in the future, and we can reevaluate the state of the world sometime.
Oh, that'd be great. I'd look forward to it.
Okay. Thank you very much, Doctor, and have a wonderful evening.
You as well. God bless.